Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about a sovereign debt crisis, what that means, why some people think it's happening now, and what are going to be the implications for this type of event kind of across the world. Welcome to the show. Today we are going to talk about something that is happening, kind of affecting the world of geopolitics. It is called a sovereign debt crisis. Sounds scary, kind of is, to be honest. And if you are watching sort of the Twitter news, you might come across this, as a lot of economists and financial people are kind of warning about an upcoming sovereign debt crisis. So I thought I would dig into what that label means, how it happens, and what the implications are if we start to see multiple sovereign debt crises around the world. So first thing is, the word sovereign in this context, or in most contexts, refers to countries. So it basically means like a national debt crisis. Countries, nations around the world, live in our modern economy, which is driven by credit and debt. Money is debt. And that means that whenever governments spend money, they generally raise that money by borrowing it through loans. If you think about it, when you're talking about, the billions of dollars that is needed to run a country, to purchase that amount of oil or food, countries don't pay for that stuff in cash. If you watch my video about the supply chain, it kind of works the same way. That everything that is funded, especially very large things, like running a country, is done through debt. Now, countries obviously raise money through taxes, but one major way that countries raise money is by issuing bonds. These are a form of debt. It's a loan that if I'm a country and I sell bonds, you as the investor are going to loan me money. I'm going to use that money to do stuff, and I'm going to pay you that money back at some point with interest. Generally, bonds are considered very safe, boring investments. The bond market is not generally where people make a lot of money. They're considered super stable, low-paying investments. Generally, if you have like a diverse portfolio, you would want to have some bonds as a way to balance out risk from something like stocks. So the reason why those are generally considered safe investments is, for the most part, a country's supposed to be a good risk for paying its bills. And you have a country like the United States, they can literally just print their own money to pay their bills. So bonds are generally considered a very safe investment. However, we have been in a very new situation in 2022 where we're seeing very high inflation. And if you watch the foreign exchange rates, you would know that the dollar, relative to other countries' currencies, has gotten very expensive. Like, the dollar's become worth more relative to other currencies. And I'll put a link in the show notes to my video on the dollar milkshake theory, as that explains a little bit more about what's going on in terms of global exchange rates. But the result is that dollars become worth a lot relative to other currencies. All exchange rates are always relative, which means that for another country, especially what we call in emerging markets or one of the smaller global economies, things have gotten more expensive for them because the global marketplace runs on dollars. If you want to buy food or oil in the global marketplace, which most countries do, very few countries are self-sufficient in terms of food and energy. So if you're going to import food or energy, or both, you have to pay for that in dollars, and you have to generally take out loans in dollars. And if dollars have become more expensive relative to your currency, then the oil and the gas have become more expensive. So it's like the cost of running a country has gone up. It is now more expensive to provide for citizens, especially in emerging markets. So what happens when you're borrowing money Interest rates have gone up because the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates, which affects things globally. Interest rates have gone up. The cost of borrowing money has gone up. Expenses have gone up. You know, oil and gas and food are now more expensive. You basically run into a problem where you can't pay your bills. And that's essentially what a sovereign debt crisis is when a nation who is funding its economy on loans cannot make the payments. They can't make the interest payments to their bondholders. They don't have enough money to buy the energy. They start to default. They don't make the payments. Now, the U.S. is in a unique situation in that if the U.S. doesn't have a lot of money, they can go to the Federal Reserve, the central bank, and ask the central bank to buy U.S. bonds as a way to raise money. And the Federal Reserve has this magical ability to create reserves out of nothing, which means they can never go bankrupt, which is kind of crazy, say out loud. However, other countries don't have that privilege because they do not issue the global reserve currency. So what's going to happen is we're going to see some of these nations that are struggling with energy bills, with food bills, with not enough credit, run out of money, and they'll default. And that is what this sovereign debt crisis revolves around, is the inability to fund the stuff that government needs to fund. And what happens when this type of situation unfolds? Well, we've seen it in the past. This is not a new thing. We haven't really seen it like globally. So there have been isolated incidents in certain countries. You know, Argentina had this problem. Zimbabwe's had this problem. You know, usually when a currency gets so, well, that's sort of one of the things that happens. So the first thing that happens is the country defaults on its ability to pay its bills. That means they don't have money to buy stuff. They can't buy the food or buy the energy, which means there are massive shortages. So when you have extreme shortages, the prices go up a ton because it's sort of like supply and demand rules. And then people get very unhappy. I mean, if you go to the grocery store and there's no food and you got kids to feed, panic sets in and you can see riots and just general civil unrest. And people will want someone to blame. So they generally will blame the government. And so you could have a situation where the government is overthrown. You could have a coup, all sorts of dramatic events that we've seen happen in countries around the world in the past. They're never good for the citizens, ever. I mean, citizens who want to be able to buy food and heat their homes at a reasonable rate that they can afford, you know, that's sort of the goal, stable economies. Whenever you have this type of a situation where people are rioting and they're starving and they're trying to overthrow the government, that's never, no one really benefits from that, especially average citizens. So also when the country's in so much trouble that they can't pay anything, what they generally do is they start printing money because their money at that day one is still worth something. So they print a whole bunch and they buy some energy or buy some food or whatever. And then the inflation starts to sit in because now there's so much money in circulation and people are panicking and paying whatever they have to pay to buy things. Prices go skyrocket, go really high. And the currency starts to devalue, so they keep printing more and more. Like it's sort of like you're drowning and you keep filling up the pool with more water, but eventually the currency hyperinflates so much that it's not worth anything. That doesn't happen very often. It's happened a couple of times in history. Weimar Germany is kind of a famous example of that. But that was also a function of people completely losing their faith in government. And that is part of what happens in this type of situation, is that if the government has like one job, right, which is to keep things, well, generally one job, they have to serve the basic needs of the citizens and make sure they don't starve and they don't freeze to death. And if they're not able to do that, then people generally are pretty mad. So that will lead to an overthrow. Now, sometimes the IMF, which is kind of connected to the World Bank, sort of like this idea of like a central bank for the world, will step in and they will give loans to these countries. The IMF does give loans in quite a few different scenarios. Sometimes they're to build things like bridges and roads or whatever. Sometimes they're in a situation of like a bailout like this. The only thing that countries have to be wary of is that there's no free lunch. So if the IMF gives a country a bailout, there generally will be an expectation of something in return. And sometimes those motives are not terribly transparent. So the citizens might not be aware of them at the time. The leaders might not even be aware of them at the time. It could be one of those situations where it's like, all right, here's your money, but just know that we're going to ask you for a favor at some point, and you're going to have to say yes, type of thing. There's a great book by John Perkins called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where he kind of talks about how this type of loan situation is used to buy votes at the UN and to find support for global policy things. So great book, kind of disturbing, but does let you understand a little bit more about how the IMF can operate. And so that's sort of one reason why a country would not want to go into a sovereign debt situation, because if you have to take bailouts from an entity like the IMF, you may have to agree to do things that you normally would not. You might have to issue a new currency altogether. We might see some central bank digital currencies be issued in countries where sovereign debt is an issue, and they decide to introduce a new monetary system if the current one gets to a situation where it's so hyperinflated it has no value. And in the meantime, while all these sort of things are being figured out, generally it's not great for citizens. There's often shortages of a lot of necessary things, which can have dire consequences. So when you see some chatter in the news about upcoming sovereign debt crises, that is what this refers to. It is when a country has a system that requires it to use loans to fund operations, and for a variety of reasons they are not able to service those loans, and they get into a situation where they're considered a bad credit risk, so they can't get new loans, and they basically run out of money, which means they can't buy necessary stuff, which leads to suffering on the part of the citizens. And sometimes all chaos ensues. The government gets kicked out, they get fired, new people are brought in, bailouts come in, and it's often a very distressing, chaotic situation. So it looks like this type of thing could be happening in Europe. We see energy shortages, we see food shortages, we see collapsing currencies. Hopefully I'm wrong and everything will be pretty chill and these things will get worked out. But it looks like some of these sad situations are coming to a country near you. All right, if you want to read more about some of these other topics, I'll put some links in the show notes, and you are welcome to join 2 Steps Ahead, which is our membership program where we talk about lots of these things in great depth and how to use some of these types of unfortunate situations to your advantage. Because in any type of major change, there's going to be good things and bad things that come out of it. And if you want to serve your family, your community, or your country in a way that requires some money, sometimes there are investment opportunities that you can hop on board. So that's what we talk about in 2 Steps Ahead, how to stay 2 steps ahead of all of these crazy types of global changes and do the best to serve our communities as we see fit. All right, we'll see you in the next video.